if you have spent, more than maybe 5 minutes on the internet lately,
Yeah.
you've probably diagnosed someone as a narcissist.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
Right. Is the ultimate modern buzzword. I mean, we use it to describe an ex who didn't text back, or a boss who took credit for our presentation.
Or just a neighbor who talks a little too loudly about their new car.
Exactly. We picture this cartoon villain, right? This invulnerable, arrogant mastermind who just loves themselves way too much.
Yeah.
But what if I told you that the loudest, most boastful person in the room, the one you are absolutely convinced is a textbook narcissist, might actually be experiencing a state of profound, agonizing private panic?
It's wild because it completely flips the script on how we view the people around us.
It really does.
We are so used to deploying that word as a weapon, like just a casual insult to explain away bad behavior. And because of that, we've completely lost sight of the clinical reality. And that reality is far more complex and, frankly, far more tragic than the social media caricatures would have you believe.
Which is exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are taking this weaponized buzzword and bringing it back down to earth for you.
Yes, exactly.
So our roadmap for this comes from a clinical brief titled Bridging the Gap: Understanding Narcissism and Clinical Care. It was developed by Coping and Healing Counseling, which is a telehealth practice based in Georgia that focuses on expanding access to specialized therapy. And the baseline they establish right out of the gate is a massive reality check.
A very necessary reality check, I'd say, because the clinical diagnosis we are looking at here, Narcissistic Personality Disorder, or NPD, is not about someone who, takes too many selfies.
Right.
The brief anchors its definition in a concept that surprises a lot of people, which is deep private suffering. When clinicians look at NPD, they aren't looking at vanity. They are looking at a pervasive pattern of distress.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because pervasive pattern sounds, well, very much like clinical jargon.
It does, yeah.
I want to know how a therapist actually separates a genuinely disordered pattern from someone who is just acting incredibly selfishly during, say, a messy breakup. What is the actual threshold there?
That's a great question. The word pervasive is really doing the heavy lifting there. I mean, a bad breakup might make someone act defensively or selfishly for a few months.
Sure, we've all been there.
Right, but that is situational. A pervasive pattern means this behavioral operating system began by early adulthood, and it infects every single domain of their life.
Wow, every domain.
Yeah, it dictates how they function at work, how they navigate friendships, how they treat their family, and how they handle romance. It is inescapable.
So it's the operating system, not just an app running in the background.
Exactly. It's a faulty operating system built on 3 core pillars. First, you have grandiosity. Second, a profound, almost desperate need for admiration. And third, a severe difficulty with empathy.
Okay, I want to challenge that first pillar for a second. Grandiosity.
Go for it.
The classic image is the person at the head of the boardroom table, right? Dominating the conversation, demanding absolute attention. But I was reading through our notes, and there's a distinction made about grandiosity occurring in fantasy.
Yes, that's crucial.
Wait, but if it is all in their head and they are quiet about it, how is that a disorder? Isn't that just having an active imagination or, being a daydreamer?
Well, I'd argue it goes much deeper than daydreaming. I mean, an active imagination is healthy, sure, but grandiosity in fantasy is a survival mechanism.
How so?
Imagine the quietest person in the office who never speaks up in meetings, but they sit in the corner absolutely fiercely convinced that they are an unrecognized genius.
Oh, wow.
Right? They aren't just hoping for a promotion. They believe they are fundamentally superior to everyone around them, and the world's failure to recognize their brilliance is an epic injustice. They don't have to be loud to be grandiose.
That feels like a huge distinction because it means you could be sitting next to someone with NPD and have absolutely no idea because the grandiosity is entirely internal.
Precisely.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how this external presentation, whether it is loud, brash, bragging, or quiet, resentful superiority, is not the core of the person.
Right.
It is a protective shell. And it is a shell designed to hide a terrifying amount of vulnerability.
Which forces us to really look underneath that behavior, to understand the mechanics of this suffering.
Yeah.
When I was trying to visualize this, the analogy that kept coming to my mind was a fortress.
A fortress, okay.
Yeah, you look at this person and they project this image of an impenetrable, intimidating fortress. But if you walk up and tap on it, you realize the entire structure is made out of incredibly thin glass.
The glass fortress is a powerful image. But let's push that a bit further to understand the actual mechanism at play. Because a glass fortress just, sits there NPD is active.
Okay.
Think of it more like an autoimmune disease of the ego.
An autoimmune disease. Wait, how so?
Well, in a physical autoimmune disease, the body's defense mechanisms become hyperactive, right? They
Mm-hmm.
start attacking healthy tissue to protect against a perceived threat.
Right.
In vulnerable narcissism, the psychological defenses are so hyperactive, so desperate to protect the fragile core self, that they attack healthy feedback, healthy relationships, and healthy boundaries.
But why are the defenses so hyperactive in the first place? I
Hmm.
mean, if someone genuinely believes they're a misunderstood genius, why do they care if a coworker points out a typo in their spreadsheet? A god shouldn't care about the opinions of mortals, right?
That paradox is the exact center of the disorder, and it's because the grandiosity isn't real.
Ah.
It is not born out of genuine, deeply rooted self-love or confidence. It is a compensation mechanism. It is a shield hiding a profoundly fragile self-esteem.
That makes a lot of sense.
The clinical material uses a phrase that is almost agonizing when you really think about the reality of living with it. It says they are exquisitely sensitive to criticism.
Exquisitely sensitive. Listen to the mechanics of that. It means their radar for rejection is just dialed up to 1,000.
Exactly. Because when your entire psychological survival relies on maintaining this grandiose illusion of perfection, a tiny piece of constructive criticism, like pointing out that spreadsheet typo, isn't processed as helpful feedback.
What is it processed as?
It is processed as an existential threat. It threatens to shatter the entire illusion. And when that glass shatters, it triggers what clinicians call a narcissistic injury.
Okay, walk me through a narcissistic injury. Because if, you or I get a mildly critical performance review, we might be annoyed, we might vent to a friend, but we generally eat lunch and move on.
Right, of course.
How does someone with NPD process that exact same event?
Well, for you, the criticism is about the work. For someone with NPD, the criticism is a devastating indictment of their entire worth as a human being.
Oh, man.
Yeah, the reaction to a narcissistic injury often bypasses standard annoyance and plunges straight into disproportionate, blinding rage. Or, conversely, deep, isolating shame and complete withdrawal.
So fight or flight on overdrive.
Exactly. They might lash out and try to destroy the person who gave the feedback, or they might just quit the job on the spot because the environment is now intolerable. Their autoimmune defense system just went into overdrive to neutralize the threat.
So we have this internal mechanism established now. The fragile core, the hyperactive autoimmune defenses of the ego, the constant risk of catastrophic narcissistic injury. But for you listening right now, you are probably wondering how this translates into the patterns we actually see in the real world.
Right. How does it look day to day?
Exactly. If they're suffering privately, how does this manifest in daily life without us just, plain armchair psychologist?
Moving from the internal to the external, the clinical signs become very distinct. We see a relentless preoccupation with success, power, or status.
Okay.
Because again, if you are terrified of being worthless, you have to constantly measure yourself against impossible metrics of ultimate success just to prove your value.
And if the world doesn't automatically hand you that success, you get the second sign, which is entitlement.
Yes. And entitlement in this context isn't just wanting nice things.
Right, it's deeper.
It is the deep-seated expectation of highly favorable treatment or automatic compliance. They genuinely feel the standard rules of society or the workplace or even a marriage simply do not apply to them because they are inherently special.
And when people inevitably fail to comply with those unspoken special rules.
It triggers the narcissistic injury, the defense mechanism activates, which leads to the third pattern, which is interpersonal exploitation.
Oh.
When other people are viewed not as complex individuals, but as mirrors existing solely to reflect your grandiosity back to you, it becomes very easy to take advantage of them. You start using people to achieve your own ends without ever considering their needs.
But there is a fourth sign you haven't mentioned yet, and honestly, this is the one that really caught my attention when reading through the clinical breakdown. Envy.
Yes, envy is huge.
It says they are either intensely envious of others, or they believe everyone else is deeply envious of them. But why envy? If you are obsessed with yourself, why do you care what the neighbor is doing?
Because the grandiose worldview is strictly hierarchical. There are winners and there are losers. There is no middle ground.
It's a zero-sum game.
Exactly. If someone else achieves something, your brain doesn't process it as, oh, good for them. Because your self-worth is entirely comparative, their success is direct, painful evidence of your inadequacy. If they are up, you must be down.
Wow, that sounds exhausting.
It is. So you either burn with envy over their success or you project your own obsession onto them and convince yourself that they are just jealous of you.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. If you step back and look at everything we just discussed, the constant scanning for criticism, the raging entitlement, the exhausting hierarchy of envy, the hyperactive defenses, that sounds like a miserable way to live.
It is completely psychologically exhausting. The sheer amount of cognitive energy required to maintain the illusion of perfection, to suppress that profound vulnerability 24 hours a day, it takes a massive toll on the brain.
Which explains a crucial clinical nuance we absolutely have to highlight for everyone. This disorder does not exist in a vacuum.
Not at all. If we connect this to the bigger picture, NPD frequently co-occurs with severe depression and anxiety.
So it's not an isolated personality glitch, it's an entire ecosystem of mental health struggles.
Think about the mechanics of it. When the grandiosity fails, which it inevitably will because nobody is perfect, or when the exhaustion of maintaining the facade simply becomes too much, depression floods the system.
The fortress collapses inward.
Exactly. And the anxiety. The anxiety is the constant low-grade hum of terror that they will be found out, that their underlying inadequacy will be exposed to the world.
It radically changes the narrative. It moves this person from a two-dimensional villain to a deeply complex patient in need of help.
And that reframing is the single most important takeaway from the clinical reality.
But that internal exhaustion forces a bigger question. If their entire defensive structure is built to deflect vulnerability, stepping into a therapist's office, where the whole point is vulnerability, must feel like walking into a fire.
It really does.
Which leads to this pervasive internet myth. I mean, you see it everywhere online. Never send a narcissist to therapy. They can't be fixed. They just learn to manipulate the therapist. Is it actually possible to treat an autoimmune disease of the ego? How do clinicians even get past that initial wall?
This is where we have to firmly rely on the evidence and reject the internet folklore. The clinical consensus is clear. Real change is absolutely possible when the individual engages genuinely.
Okay, that's good news.
Is it difficult? Exceptionally. Because the very act of sitting in a therapist's chair and saying, I have a problem, is a massive narcissistic injury. It requires admitting a flaw.
Right. So standard, tell me about how your week went. Therapy session probably won't cut it. They need something that bypasses the defense mechanisms.
Standard talk therapy can sometimes actually backfire if it's not targeted, because a highly intelligent person with NPD might just intellectually spar with the therapist.
Make it a competition.
Right. That is why the clinical brief highlights highly specialized, evidence-informed approaches designed specifically for this architecture, like psychodynamic therapy.
Walk me through how those actually work in the room. Because listing off names of therapies doesn't tell us much. How does a therapist dismantle the defenses without triggering the rage?
Let's look at schema therapy, for example. In schema therapy, the therapist isn't arguing with the patient about whether they were right or wrong in a fight with their spouse.
That would just be feeding the defenses.
Exactly. Instead, they are looking at schemas, which are essentially the faulty blueprints of self-worth the patient drew up as a child.
Blueprints, I like that.
Yeah, the therapist helps the patient map out these blueprints. They might say, look at this pattern. Every time you feel ignored, your blueprint tells you that you are fundamentally worthless, so you lash out to regain control. They bring the subconscious operating system into the conscious light and then slowly work together to redraft a healthier blueprint.
It's architectural repair. And what about transference-focused psychotherapy? That sounds intense.
It is incredibly intense, but highly effective. In transference-focused psychotherapy, the therapy room itself becomes a safe laboratory. The therapist knows that the patient's toxic interpersonal patterns are going to show up right there in the room.
Oh, so the patient might become enraged at the therapist.
Yes, or try to demean them or try to manipulate them.
They transfer their real-world behavior onto the clinician.
Exactly. But instead of getting defensive, the therapist uses it in real time. They stop and say, notice what just happened here. I challenge your perspective, and your immediate reaction was to try and make me feel incompetent. Let's explore why that defense mechanism just activated.
That is brilliant.
It is. It allows the patient to see their own exploitation and hostility in a controlled environment where it won't destroy the relationship.
That requires an incredibly skilled, incredibly patient clinician.
It does. There's also mentalization-based treatment, which specifically targets that third pillar we mentioned earlier, the lack of empathy.
Wait, how do you teach empathy? I thought that was just something you inherently had or didn't have.
Well, empathy can be viewed as a cognitive skill. It's the ability to mentalize, which means understanding your own mental state and recognizing that other people have completely separate, equally valid internal worlds.
Okay, say.
A person with NPD often struggles to realize that their spouse's sadness isn't an attack on them, it's just the spouse's independent emotion. Mentalization therapy exercises that specific muscle, teaching them to read the emotional states of others accurately rather than filtering everything through their own paranoia.
That is a very serious clinical toolkit.
Right.
But reading through the brief, there is a massive caveat that we have to underline in red ink right now, a rule that applies to everyone listening.
Yes, the golden rule of this entire subject.
Yeah.
Diagnosis must be made by a licensed clinician. It should never, ever be a label thrown like a weapon in a personal argument.
Right. You do not scream, "You're a narcissist," in the middle of a fight about who's supposed to pick up the kids.
When you use it as an insult, you're not diagnosing. You are just trying to hurt the other person or invalidate their perspective to win an argument.
Which is pretty ironic.
It is. You are ironically using a clinical term about a lack of empathy to demonstrate your own lack of empathy in that moment.
Wow. Yeah.
Furthermore, the clinical guidance makes it clear that therapy isn't just for the person with the disorder. The relational fallout of living with someone with these hyperactive defenses is profound. Partners, children, and family members carry a tremendous amount of invisible trauma.
They absolutely do.
They need their own therapeutic space to heal, to untangle the manipulation, and to learn how to set ironclad boundaries.
Which brings us to a massive systemic problem. Listening to the mechanics of schema therapy or transference-focused psychotherapy, it sounds specialized. It sounds expensive.
It traditionally is, yes.
Historically, this kind of intense psychiatric help has been heavily gatekept. If you lived in a major city and had endless disposable income, maybe you could find a specialist. But for the average person, hitting a wall of wait lists, geographical barriers, and prohibitive costs makes healing feel totally impossible.
The logistics of mental health care have historically been just as brutal as the conditions themselves. And this is where the model outlined by coping and healing counseling in Georgia is so vital because it disrupts that inequality. It is a blueprint for democratizing access to complex care.
How do they actually bridge that gap practically? Because knowing you need a culturally competent therapist who understands personality structures is one thing. Actually getting into a virtual room with one is another.
They do it by entirely removing the geographical and financial friction. First, they operate a 100% telehealth IPA-compliant model.
Which means the barrier of driving an hour across town, taking a half day off work, or sitting in a vulnerable waiting room is just gone.
Exactly. And critically, because it is virtual, they can serve the entire state. The rural healthcare divide is a massive crisis in mental health right now.
Oh, absolutely.
But under this model, someone living in a remote county in Georgia has the exact same access to a diverse team of over 15 licensed therapists as someone living in downtown Atlanta.
That's incredible. And what kind of licenses are we talking about?
They have highly qualified clinical social workers, professional counselors, and marriage and family therapists. And they offer individual, couples, family, and teen therapy for ages 13 and up, plus life coaching.
But let's talk about the real elephant in the room. Let's talk about money. Because specialized team of licensed therapists usually comes with a terrifying price tag that immediately locks out the people who need it most.
The financial model is arguably the most revolutionary part of their approach. When we talk about democratizing care, it has to be economically viable. Coping and healing counseling accepts Medicaid.
Wait, Medicaid, which comes with a $0 copay.
A $0 copay.
That is huge.
Think about the impact of that. It completely dismantles the financial barrier for a massive portion of the population that has historically been excluded from specialized mental health care.
And what about regular insurance?
Even for those utilizing major commercial plans like Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Healthcare, Humana, the out-of-pocket reality is usually just a standard copay of $10 to $40 per session, making it remarkably affordable compared to the traditional cash pay specialist models.
That really changes everything.
For anyone in Georgia navigating these complex patterns, whether dealing with it internally or trying to heal a family dynamic, this kind of accessible infrastructure is genuinely life-changing.
It takes it from an abstract clinical theory to a tangible lifeline. And if you are in Georgia and want to explore that lifeline, they make it straightforward to connect through their website at htherapy.com, or you can literally just call them at 404-832-0102.
It's that easy.
So what does this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at a word that the internet has utterly weaponized, a buzzword we use to dismiss people, to paint them as cartoon villains so we don't have to deal with their complexity. But By walking through this clinical brief, we have completely flipped the script.
We really have. We've moved from the colloquial insult to the clinical reality.
We've seen that underneath the grandiosity and the entitlement is a fragile glass fortress. We've explored the autoimmune disease of the ego, the hyperactive defenses that cause exquisite sensitivity to criticism and devastating narcissistic injury. And most importantly, we learned that this condition is often tangled up with exhausting depression and anxiety. It is not a fixed evil trait. It is a painful disorder.
And like many painful disorders, when met with genuine engagement and accessible, culturally competent care, healing is possible. The myth that these individuals are beyond help is a barrier we just have to tear down.
Understanding this material doesn't just give you a better vocabulary. It elevates your mental health literacy. It allows you to look at the people in your life with a sharper, more empathetic lens. And ultimately, that protects your relationships and your own well-being.
It absolutely does. And this raises an important question, something for you to consider as you log off today.
What's that?
If we now understand that this is a disorder rooted in deep, agonizing private suffering, and yet the label narcissist continues to be thrown around as a casual, everyday insult to win arguments, how many people who genuinely suffer from this condition or its underlying depression and anxiety are being driven away from the very therapy that could finally help them heal?
It really makes you wonder if our obsession with armchair diagnosing is actually making the mental health crisis worse. Until next time, keep diving deep.